Hello, I'm Cheryl Hawkins. Welcome to Solutions, the series that highlights the incredible work that nonprofits do every day to help solve problems in our communities. On this edition of Solutions, we are highlighting the Treehouse of Montgomery County, Maryland. The Treehouse is a child advocacy center that is dedicated to reducing trauma and promoting healing for child and adolescent victims of sexual abuse, physical abuse, and neglect. Let's take a look at what the Treehouse Child Advocacy Center does.
So the whole purpose of a child advocacy center is to minimize the trauma for an abused child and help them start the healing process. So I'm Charlie Regan. I'm the Executive Director at the Treehouse Child Advocacy Center of Montgomery County, Maryland. Before there were child advocacy centers, an abused child was taken and interviewed from agency to agency. That child was forced to relive that trauma over and over and over again. The purpose of a child advocacy center is to be that one place that is safe and feels comforting for a child. We are the hub of the wheel. We provide a safe and comfortable environment, and with all of the other agencies, we coordinate and facilitate communication, collaboration, where they come to us. So that child only has to really relive that trauma once, and we can immediately start that healing process.
And now joining me in the studio to talk about the important work of the Treehouse Child Advocacy Center of Montgomery County, Maryland, is the Executive Director of Treehouse, Charles Regan. Charles, welcome to Solutions.
Oh, thank you. Great to be here.
Great to have you here. It is sad that we have to have organizations like yours, that children are dealing with these kind of issues, but we do have to have them, and we're glad that your organization exists. So what is the history of the Treehouse Child Advocacy Center? How long has it been around?
So we've been a child advocacy center here in Montgomery County since 2002. Prior to that, it was in some form or another part of Department of Health and Human Services. But we, a separate child advocacy center in 2002. In 2016, we actually became fully independent 501c3, our own standalone nonprofit. And
what population do you serve?
So we serve the children of Montgomery County who are victims of sexual abuse, physical abuse, neglect, or really any serious trauma.
It takes special people to deal with that. How did you get involved with the Treehouse?
So interestingly, when my oldest son was in middle school, he chose the Treehouse as his service project. So in getting to know the Treehouse, it was right at the same time that they were forming their own 501c3, becoming their own independent nonprofit. So I served on the board, in the initial board. During COVID was devastating for a lot of nonprofits, but particularly Treehouse from a financial standpoint and otherwise. And so during that time, a lot of transition was going on. So I stepped off the board, and with my background, I stepped into the role of executive director to try to, help them navigate through those times. And that's been a little over 2 years now. And I can tell you it's the most rewarding job I've ever done.
And so with your background, what did you bring to them that they needed?
Really a sort of more of a sense of business, like you're a nonprofit, but we still have to keep the lights on and salaries paid. So just an outside perspective from an organizational standpoint. And in the last 2 years, we were able to reorganize, really put more support for the group, the teammates, and the team members that do the work, the hard work, and in that time, we've even been able to expand our services and the number of children and families that we're able to support.
And that's so important that you said that, because a lot of people think nonprofits, that word, nonprofit, that we're not trying to generate any profits per se, but we are trying to provide services. And it is a corporation, it's a business. It has to operate. You know, it's got to have the funds to take care of the needs, rent, you know, all those kinds of things, people's salaries, all those things, you got to have it. So your organization is dealing with child abuse. How, first, give me a definition of child abuse.
Well, I think what's interesting here in Maryland is the distinction between abuse and assault.
Right.
And the difference really is defined as it's defined here is the actions might be the same, but the relationship of the victim to the perpetrator is what is the difference. So if it is, as they say, a care and custody issue. So if the person that is the perpetrator of the abuse, whether it's physical or sexual or even neglect, is a teacher, a parent, a coach, someone in a position of authority over that child, then it is an abuse. And that's primarily what we deal with, versus a stranger or someone unknown to that child that is an assault. So that's a really simple delineation. How
much of the abuse of children that you see is sexual in nature?
So for us, we see a little over 85% of the children that we see are victims of sexual abuse. We also, obviously, oftentimes that's a part of physical abuse becomes part of that, and neglect. But the difficult part with sexual abuse is it's less reported, and it's physically not manifested the same way, you know, other abuse is, bruising, broken bones, that type of thing. So there's a shame associated with it, so it's often unreported. So, and when it is reported, it's often well after the fact. So from the victim standpoint, emotionally, it's built up a lot over time. So
yeah, so I guess it's least reported because it's children and they don't know how to express it, or afraid to tell it, or
afraid to tell. A lot of threats that go into it, the consequences they don't understand often if they're young. So we are a child advocacy center, so we deal with infants up until 18 years old. So and of that, about a third are, you know, infants to 6 years old. 7 to 12 is about a third, and 13 to 18 is kind of how we distinguish them. But the younger the child, they really aren't always aware of what's going on. Sometimes they know it's bad, but, you know, and if it's a person that's in a position of authority over them, they're even more hesitant. You know, it's not that person's fault. It's something I did. So yes, it's oftentimes, more often, unreported.
Yeah, and so for nonprofits to exist, there has to be a need for it. How prevalent is child abuse in Montgomery County?
It's prevalent throughout the country.
Yeah, more than we think.
Yes, one interesting statistically, what you find is in the more affluent jurisdictions, in the more affluent counties, of which Montgomery is one of them, there less attention is paid to sexual abuse. It's uncomfortable, right? It's uncomfortable topic. It's sort of a hidden. But certainly the need is there. We are the largest population in the state.
Okay.
And so, you know, and the most diverse. So there's an absolute, you know, unfortunately, there's a need, an even greater need than we can fulfill at this time.
Wow. Yeah. So the Treehouse is a child advocacy center. What is a child advocacy center?
Well, the child advocacy centers, or CACs as they're known, it's unique to the United States, this model. And it was started in the mid-'80s. And to give you an example, prior to this model of child advocacy center, if there was a suspicion of abuse, it would be reported, and the child would be interviewed by a social worker from Child Protective Services. They would be interviewed by a police detective. They'd be taken to the hospital, interviewed by a doctor, often a nurse, multiple times. Back to interviewed multiple times by law enforcement during the investigative stage, and then moving on to, you know, if it went to prosecution, the state's attorney, whomever. So a young child would be interviewed 4, 5, 6, 7 times about the same. They're reliving that trauma over and over again. The core of a child advocacy center is when there is a credible suspicion or allegation of abuse, that child is brought to the child advocacy center, and a dedicated forensic interviewer is set up, and they talk to that child in a specialized way. This is what they're trained to do. And then all of those other agencies, the investigative agencies, the police, the social workers, the caseworkers, they are observing this in a separate room.
Okay.
The idea is this child only has to relive that trauma once.
Yeah.
And then from there, we can then start the process in the Child Advocacy Center of what we call the healing process, and getting them, he or she, the help that they need to start to recover so they can start leading a normal life again.
This is a very important service that you're providing. Do you have to have any kind of accreditation to be involved with children in this way?
Yes. So overall, there is we are accredited. We're one of close to 1,000 child advocacy centers in the country. It's accredited by something called the National Children's Alliance, and we're accredited every few years. And it's fairly rigorous. So yes, there's a rigorous accreditation and criteria program.
Yeah. So how many people are on your staff?
So currently we have 16.
Wow. Okay.
And that's we have 4 main services divided into 4 main services that we provide.
Okay.
So the first being forensic interview, as I said, and which is really what starts the process. From there, we are really fortunate that under one roof, we have an experienced child abuse pediatrician and a child abuse registered nurse in-house, and we get referrals for examinations and for the children. So we have a medical team, and then we also have a mental health team. So these are specially trained trauma therapists that work with children. Children are amazingly resilient, so the sooner you can get them into some type of therapy, you can lessen the effects of PTSD or eliminate them altogether and start them on the process, like I said, to healing. We're not long-term, 6 months to a year or so, but get the child over that trauma or through that trauma, so then they may go on to longer-term care somewhere else, but like I said, have them go on so they can start feeling like they're leading a normal life again.
Right. So what's unique about the Treehouse than other child advocacy centers?
Well, a couple of things. Well, first, we're the only completely free service and resource in Montgomery County. Because of that, our population, tends to be uninsured, underinsured, or undocumented. Okay. So that gives you an idea of the population that we primarily service. But also, having all of those services, the medical, the mental health, the advocacy, where we work with the families, the non-offending caregivers of these children, having that all under one roof is fairly unique. Our role is really putting the child first. So we are the ones, the Child Advocacy Center, that actually helps facilitate and coordinate communication between and among the investigative organizations like the police, the prosecution, child welfare services, and we think of us as the hub in that wheel surrounding that child, making sure that child gets anything he or she needs to be supported through this process, because it's a difficult and painful process.
Yeah. So what are you most proud of the work that's being done at the Treehouse?
You know, I would say on a large scale, in spite of all the challenges that came to us through COVID and financial challenges, that the staff and the team at the Treehouse continued to provide top quality services and support to these victims day after day, and they continue to do so. And we are now for the first time in our history, in our own space. That means our own. We're not sharing it with 3 or 4 other agencies. We have our own, child-friendly, safe lobby area for the children to come in, and we have expanded our services, and it's really the team at the Treehouse that continues to do this day in and day out that I'm probably most proud of. Yeah.
Fantastic. Charles Regan, thank you so much for being with us on Solutions. Treehouse is so important. The work you're doing is invaluable.
Well, thank you so much.
Yes, we're going to take a short break, and when we come back, I'll be joined by Molly Cupid, Mental Health Director with the Treehouse, Montgomery County, Maryland. Stay with us. We'll be right back.
It takes a lot of different professionals to help protect a child who's been abused or neglected. The medical part is just one portion of the care of the child.
Internally, we are multidisciplinary in nature. So we have a forensic interviewer, we've got a medical team, we've got family advocates, and we've got a full mental health team.
We have therapists that speak Spanish, so that also eliminates a huge barrier. We're a free, no-cost service. I think that a lot of families appreciate that they can find really amazing therapists to work with their children without having to pay out of pocket for it.
If for any reason a parent is unable to get a ride here, whether if they don't drive, which most of our families unfortunately do not drive, then we do provide free transportation.
It's really helpful that all of the different departments are housed in one building. So for T3, we work really closely with the county, who are actually right next door, and sometimes it's so great that I can just walk over and discuss some big things that came up in a session with the social worker who's right next door.
Welcome back. I'm Cheryl Hawkins. You're watching Solutions, the series that highlights the great work that nonprofits do in our communities. On this episode, we're learning about the work of the Treehouse Child Advocacy Center in Montgomery County, Maryland. On this segment of the show, my guest is Molly Cupid, Mental Health Director with Treehouse. Molly, welcome to Solutions.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you for being here. So you are the Mental Health Director with the Treehouse. What are the ages of the children you work with, and what are the services you provide in terms of mental health?
In terms of mental health, so we can work with children up to 18 at the Treehouse for the general services that we provide, but for the mental health services, the therapy services, it varies a little bit more depending on what kind of therapy we're going to be doing. We provide very few services to infants and toddlers, but we can provide some services to their caregivers under certain circumstances. We have an evidence-based treatment that we can provide for little ones between the ages of 2 and 6. And then the majority of the children that we work with for therapy are, I would say, between 6 and 17, as opposed to on the younger side. Okay. So you all work with partners. Who are some of the partners that you work with? Sure. So we partner very closely with Montgomery County Child Welfare Services and the Montgomery County Police Department, particularly the Special Victims Investigations Division. And we also work very closely with the Office of the County Attorney and the State's Attorney's Office here in Montgomery County. Okay. And like I had mentioned with Charles, it takes very special people to do this kind of work. Yes, ma'am. Tell me a little bit about you. What's your background? How did you come to the Treehouse? Oh, sure. I grew up here in Montgomery County, born and raised, and I ended up sort of moving to North Carolina for a little bit after college, and sort of accidentally tripped and fell and found my way into working with children who'd been abused or who had their own problematic sexual behaviors, and realized that that's exactly what I wanted to be doing. That was the work I wanted to do. And so that's when I went back to school, got my master's, and moved back home up here to Montgomery County. And then I've been working with children in this capacity in a variety of different organizations and ways since then. So tell me, what's the first thing that generally happens with a child who's been referred to the Treehouse, and more specifically, a child who's been referred to you with mental health challenges? Sure. What do you do? So typically a child comes in for a forensic interview, and that's sort of what kicks everything off and starts things on our end at the Treehouse. And the that child is coming from the Child Welfare Services? They are sending them to you, or the police department? Or? One of those two, yes. We don't do forensic interviews just for somebody who calls up and is like, I think something happened. There does need to be an open investigation with either Child Welfare Services or the police department in order for us to conduct that interview. But then if those things are the case, then we can do the interview. And then from there, based on what's disclosed during that forensic interview, we sort of, and by we, I mean the team, not me, makes the decision about what other services within the treehouse and outside of the treehouse that child might need. So from there, referrals could be made to our medical team. Our family advocates are typically on site and present for the forensic interview, so they can be involved with the family from the very beginning. And then they may also be referred to the mental health team for ongoing therapy services. And so that's sort of what starts the ball rolling.
Right. And then when they get to you for the mental health side, what do you do? How do you break the ice, kind of say?
Sure.
Yeah.
So as a child advocacy center, there are some guidelines around the services that we're allowed to provide. So we are only able to use evidence-based treatments, which means all of the therapy that we provide, there's specific research that backs that it's useful, that it works, and how to provide it. And so we make sure that those are the things that we are doing with these kids and with their non-offending caregivers. And so from the beginning, we check in with the child and with the non-offending caregiver and try to get a history, figure out exactly sort of what we're looking at, both from the history of the trauma, which is very, very rarely is there one time that one bad thing happened. It is most often something bad happened multiple times and probably a few different kinds of bad things. And so figuring out exactly what we're working with and what that looks like, what the symptoms look like for the child at that point, if they've had any history of self-harm or suicidal ideation, you know, what other services might need to be in place to help ensure that the child is safe and safe enough to begin talking about these things.
Wow. So what role does the family play in this process?
The family plays a major role. The children are only with us for a short time, right? Like even if they're coming for therapy, that's an hour a week. They live at home with their family the rest of that time. So having a non-offending caregiver participating in treatment is one of our requirements. Because, and that doesn't mean that they're in every session for the entire session. And it also doesn't mean that we report back to that caregiver and say, here's everything your kid told us today. That's not the purpose. But the goal is that the caregiver is learning everything that the child is learning so that they can support that child in those ways outside of therapy. So if we're teaching a child relaxation skills and coping skills and the signs that they are starting to escalate and move towards a temper tantrum or a panic attack or thoughts of wanting to harm themselves, that they start to learn to recognize those things, but so does their caregiver. And then their caregiver can say, oh, remember those things we learned with Miss Molly? Let's do some deep breathing together. Let's relax our bodies together, and can support them in those ways at home outside of sessions.
And then sometimes the decision is made that the child needs to be removed from that home. Who makes that decision? Is it you all at the treehouse? Is it one of your partners? How does that happen?
Yeah, no, that's our partner agency, Montgomery County Child Welfare Services. So that's not a decision that the treehouse makes or really has a part in.
But are you a part of the discussion around it based on that group thing that all of the partners have taken a look at this interview? And is it a part of a group decision?
We may report on what we know and say, you know, that we've seen these symptoms or the child disclosed this in the forensic interview, but that's really the extent of our role. We are not one of the decision makers when it comes to whether or not a child needs to be removed and placed in the foster care system.
Do you work with children who have been removed?
Yes, we do. Yeah. One of the services that we provide, we call it T3. It's the transitional trauma therapy. That's actually a program that was developed with the treehouse in conjunction with our Montgomery County Child Welfare Service partners. And the idea is to mitigate the trauma of that initial removal and placement into the system, because that can be really difficult, as you could imagine. And so it's a short-term intervention where our therapist actually goes into the foster home and works with the child, but also their new caregiver. To sort of provide some education on here's what things that you can expect when kids have these kinds of histories. They may present a little differently than a typically developing child who was raised in a safe home. So you might expect different things from this child than from your own child, but also to help start building the relationship between the child and their new caregiver with the goal of helping that child feel more safe and secure, having the new caregiver feel equipped for managing this child, and also hoping that that relationship begins to build, which reduces the need for kids to be replaced and replaced.
Right. Does that happen a lot?
It does. It happens sometimes, and sometimes it can't be avoided. But you know, we're doing what we can and working with our partners who also do what they can to provide as much consistency and stability for these kids as possible.
So are there any costs involved with the services that you provide?
I mean, there's a lot of costs involved with our services, but we don't pass that on to our clients. So there's no costs for our clients. So the medical services, family advocacy, the interview, any therapy, it's all free. Nothing, our clients aren't charged for anything. We also are able to provide transportation. So if we have clients who don't drive or can't get to us for one reason or another, we don't want that to be a barrier in that child receiving services. So we will use we'll provide transportation through Uber Health, which is a HIPAA-compliant arm of Uber. And although there obviously are costs associated with that, that's not something that's passed on to the client. We absorb that.
Oh, wow. That's great. So you all have to do a lot of fundraising to get the funds to take
We do.
Yeah, but that's great. And that's what a nonprofit does. It makes it easier for the clients.
We think it's important.
That they serve, yeah. So you are one of the instructors for forensic interview training in the state of Maryland. What's involved with forensic interview training?
Sure. So I was one of the instructors, but that's something that shifted when I came to the Treehouse. But I am still a forensic interviewer, and so that is one of my roles currently. And so forensic interviewing is really the idea that you are having a conversation and asking questions in a way that is non-biased, neutral and open-ended, and allows a child the opportunity to share what they know without feeling like they're trying to please you with their answers.
Okay, that's interesting. I'm just curious about that. How do you see that in a child that think they're just saying what you want them to say?
Right, no, that's fair. You know, sometimes. So one of the things that we do at the beginning of an interview is sort of set out the ground rules, okay? And so one of the things that I'll do is I'll let them know, like, hey, I'm gonna ask you questions today, and if I say something that's wrong, I need you to correct me because you are the expert, not me. And so you get to tell me if I get something wrong. And especially if it's a little one, you might even give them an example. Like if I said, Cheryl, that your pants were bright red, what would you say? And then they usually laugh and they say, no, they're purple. And that helps them feel a little bit more comfortable. But I've given them permission that even though I'm a grown up, you can tell me if I'm wrong, and that helps a lot.
I get that. And so you also you collaborate with the Special Victims Investigation Division of Montgomery County to provide sex abuse related training to police officers, social workers, and other first response responders. What are some of those things you do in training those professionals?
Sure. Well, since we work so closely with special victims, I've done a couple of trainings with some of the detectives there, presenting, for example, to like newer academy classes at the police academy, and just talking generally about trauma, about what a child sex abuse investigation looks like, about the different services, and generally what a child advocacy center is, what we can provide, how we can help, how they can get in touch with us, those kinds of things.
So what are some symptoms of maltreatment that may present itself in a child? What are you looking for? What do you see? And if I, listening to you, saw some of those, how would I report it? Or can I?
Sure. So anybody can report. If you have a concern that something has happened to a child, you should report. There are certain folks who are mandated reporters and required by law to report: teachers, licensed social workers, therapists, police officers, social workers, those kinds of people. But anybody can make a report if you have a concern. It's not your job to investigate and find out, like, is this something that happened? If you've got a concern, you can call Montgomery County Child Welfare Services. They have a screening hotline number, and call and give them the information that you have. And they're not going to tell you if they're going to take it in or not going to take it in, but they will say, thank you for giving us that information, and you may hear something else and you may not, but you have done your duty to let them know, like, okay, here's the concerns. As far as signs or symptoms that something is going on with a child, that really runs the gamut. There are so many ways, right? So some kids become really behavioral, and they might be angry or aggressive, but some kids become very people-pleasy, and so they do a great job following instructions. There's never a behavior problem. Their grades are great, and it's anything in between. So there's really not one presentation that lets you know, aha, something happened and it was probably this, and here's where we are. So it's difficult. Kids are people too.
So we're just about out of time, but can you give me one success story story that comes to mind for you?
Oh, sure. We had a recent graduate from our therapy program. She's a middle school girl, and she was referred to us because she'd been sexually abused by multiple perpetrators and was having ongoing instances of self-harm. And when she came to us, her symptoms were really high, and she was diagnosed with post-traumatic stress disorder, and she was having frequent panic attacks and flashbacks of the abuse. Since during about the 12, 15 months that she was in therapy with us, she actually saw one of her perpetrators take a plea agreement and so accept some kind of responsibility. And she is now prepared to testify in her other abuser's trial within the next month or so, if it comes to that. Even though she graduated from the therapy services with the Treehouse, the family advocacy team is still supporting her and her family and will continue to be with her through that criminal trial process. So they still have some Treehouse involvement and support. And at the end of her time with us, her symptoms had reduced so drastically that she no longer met diagnostic criteria for post-traumatic stress disorder. And at her graduation, she was really focused on thinking about what she wants to be when she grows up, her future, and her birthday that was coming up soon.
I love it. Thank you, Molly.
Absolutely.
For being here. Thank you for the work that you all do at the Treehouse. It's so very important.
Thank you. We think so too.
I'd like to thank my guests, Charles Regan, Executive Director, and Molly Cupid, Mental Health Director of the Treehouse Child Advocacy Center of Montgomery County, Maryland, for being on this episode of Solutions. If you'd like more information about the Treehouse or want to know how you can help, you can visit their website at treehousemd.org, or you can call them at 240-777-4699. I'm Cheryl Hawkins. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time for more Solutions.